Two packets for the reproductive system. The first packet is pretty much an overview of the reproductive physiology. We'll talk about the role of our sex cells, which are called gametes. We'll talk a little bit about the events that are involved in the reproductive function and fertilization. And then later on, we'll look at the reproductive activity over the course of the human lifespan. So our first objective is talking about the sex chromosomes and sex hormones that are involved. So the reproductive system is really not anything, but all the organs and glands and cells and hormones that are involved in the process of mating, gametogenesis, or anything that has to do with producing an offspring. So that is the main role of the reproductive system: reproduction or producing future progeny. So we've got the gonads involved. That is going to be testis for males, ovaries for females. This includes two major functions, so the production of these sex cells, but also the secretion of sex hormones. So sex hormones are important not only for maturing or for developing those sex cells, those gametes, but also for developing the secondary sexual characteristics that are associated with male sex and with female sex. And then we also have the accessory reproductive organs that are included here. We can think about this as being like the uterus, the fallopian tubes, the vas deferens, the prostate. All of these are kind of also involved in an accessory or a supportive role in terms of reproduction. Let's talk about the sex hormones. So we've got testes producing androgens. Estrogen is one of those androgens. We've got ovaries in females, which produce estrogens and progesterone. But although males have more androgens than females, and females have more estrogens and progesterones than males, understand that both sexes produce these steroid hormones in different quantities, but they're both produced in both sexes. And this is where we get the idea that gender or secondary sex characteristics are not necessarily black or white, but there's that gradation depending on the quantities of these hormones. The adrenal cortex also plays a role here in producing some of the androgens. So if you remember the layers of the adrenal cortex, we talked about those three layers. One of those layers produces androgens as well. The accessory reproductive organs are going to be organs of the reproductive tract that actually help to transport the gametes. So in females, that's going to be the fallopian tubes, that's going to be the uterus, that's going to be the vagina. In males, that's going to be the vas deferens, the seminal vesicles, the prostate, and so on. And then the glands that help to secrete fluids that kind of lubricate that tract. Again, the prostate in males, the bulbourethral glands in females. And I'm sure we would have looked at some of these structures in anatomy lab. So this is kind of where they come into place in terms of reproductive function. Either they're helping to transport gametes, or they're producing the lubricating fluid that makes the movement of these gametes a lot easier. Let's talk about copulation. I can never say that word, copulation. So copulation is the act of mating, or in layman's, we refer to this as sex. This is when sperm is deposited into the female reproductive tract. And this is where ovum, which are the female reproductive cells, or eggs, which we call them female eggs, this is where they can become fertilized. This doesn't always happen, but this is where we have the potential to create new life when these eggs are fertilized. After fertilization, we have a pregnancy. This is the gestational period, so that 9-month period where this fertilized embryo develops to a full fetus. In the first 2 months, we call this product an embryo. Beyond that 2 months, we call this a fetus up until birth. And then beyond birth, which happens around 9 months in a normal healthy pregnancy, We call that product an infant or a newborn after parturition has taken place. And parturition is referring to the process of birth. Okay, so these are kind of the events that follow fertilization up until the delivery of that infant. Let's speak here about the sexual differentiation of male and female. So chromosomes are basically the genetic material that determine whether a fetus develops into a male and has testes, or whether they develop into a female and has ovaries. We call this process sex determination. Now, the area that's responsible for sex determination is actually on the Y chromosome. There's an area on the Y chromosome called the SRY gene, SRY standing for sex determining region of the Y chromosome. And this area has some genes that will stimulate the development of male sexual hormones, but also male reproductive organs. So if the SRY gene is present, we get the development of testes, which goes on to produce male characteristics, male organs. If the SRY gene is absent, then the default development is to ovaries and to female reproductive structures. So this is where we get the notion in science that the default option for development of a fetus is female. Because if you do nothing to a fertilized ovum, if there is no SOY gene, if there's no, none of the factors here, which I'll talk about in a minute, that code for these hormones, then the default option of development is automatically female. So the SRY gene actually codes for testis determining factor, TDF. And this is a set of protein factors that basically cause the development of testes for one, but also prevent the development of ovaries. So they're going to be doing two things. They're going to allow the testes to develop, and then testes will eventually create some hormones that can further create the secondary sex structures, but they're also going to kind of inhibit or stop the female structures, which are ovaries, from developing. So sex differentiation, again, controlled by hormones, takes place within the first 2 weeks. So from the time of fertilization up until the first 2 weeks, that embryo is pretty much sexually indifferent. It's neither male or female, but beyond 2 weeks, we start to get the sexual differentiation process taking place. So there are two structures that are developed during that 2-week period. The Wolffian duct, which is the precursor to the male reproductive structures, and then we've got the Mullerian duct, which is the precursor to the female reproductive structures. So if the testes persists, and remember, the persistence of the testes is dependent upon that SRY gene. So if this embryo has a Y chromosome, then they're going to have the SRY gene. The SRY gene is going to code for that TDF, the testis determining factor, and that is going to allow the development of testes. Once those testes begin to develop, they're going to secrete testosterone. Testosterone is going to stimulate the further development of the Wolffian duct, which is going to give us the male reproductive structures. But the testis will also secrete MIH, which is Mullerian inhibiting hormone, and that is going to cause the Mullerian duct, which is also present up until 2 weeks, that's going to cause that Mullerian duct to start to regress or to degenerate. And that is if we have testis present due to the SRY gene. If we don't have testis present, remember, if we don't have the SRY gene, the default option is to develop ovaries. We don't have testosterone. We don't have MIH. And so the Wolffian duct will regress. The Mullerian duct will continue to develop or to persist. And then that will give us the female reproductive structures. So it's kind of a weird process here where if you did nothing to this fertilized ovum, it should go on to develop into a female. But if you exposed it to this TDF, which is coded for by this SRY gene, then something else will happen and will develop into the male. And this is where we get a few of the sex disorders. So if you, for example, if you had a female, if you had a female who had, or sorry, if you had a male development who had problems with the SOY gene, there was some sort of dysfunction with this region of the Y chromosome, then that embryo would still develop with female characteristics because there's no SOY, there's no TDF. So you can have a, how do we say, a genetic female, you can have a genetic male, sorry, presenting as a physical female if there is abnormalities with the SOY gene on the Y chromosome. So here is an illustration of that kind of sexual differentiation. So this is how the this is how the development looks up until 2 weeks. We have the Wolffian duct and the Müllerian duct, and then we've got the primitive gonads. So the primitive gonads will either become the testis or the ovaries, depending again on that SOY gene. So if we have the SOY, which gives us the TDF, the testis determining factor, we go on to create testis, and then the testis will secrete two hormones, testosterone and Müllerian inhibiting hormone, and those two hormones will allow the development of the secondary sex, not secondary, the male the reproductive structures, as well as MIH, which is causing the regression of the Müllerian duct. If we don't have the SOY gene and we don't have the testis determining factor, then ovaries will develop. And because there is no testosterone and there is no Müllerian inhibiting hormone, then the Wolffian duct will regress or disappear, and the Müllerian duct will continue on to develop to give us the uterine tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. Whereas in males, the Wolffian duct will go on to give us the vas deferens, the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and so on. Alrighty, let's speak a little bit about the pattern of reproductive activity over the human lifespan. So we've got certain we've got certain phases or stages of reproductive development, which kind of start off at puberty. So anywhere from 10 to 14 years old, we have sexual maturation, and that is the development of the secondary sexual characteristics. So in males, that's going to be deepening of the voice, enhanced muscular development, development of the scrotal development, other sexual secondary reproductive characteristics, as well as the production of gametes from the testes. In females, that's going to be other hormones, development of the breast, et cetera, et cetera. And that sort of kicks off at puberty, which should be anywhere from 10 to 14 years old. There is this idea of precocious puberty. So precocious puberty is if puberty happens before 10 years of age. So if we have the development of the menses or the menstrual cycle before 10 years of age, or deepening of the voice in boys, that is what we call precocious puberty. And that is thought to be becoming more prevalent in recent times, and that may be associated with several environmental factors, etc. But typically, puberty should start anywhere from 10 to 14 years. We also have the sexual maturation happening. So we've got the reproductive cycles beginning, so the process of developing sperms, and then the process of developing ovum, which is the menstrual cycle. And that leads us all the way up to menopause in females, which is where females lose their reproductive capacity. They're no longer producing viable ova each month. In males, it's slightly different. Males kind of attain their ability to produce sperm even late into their old age. The males as late as 60, 70 years olds can still produce sperm. The quality may begin to diminish, but they still do have that, that capacity to produce sperm. And actually on this slide, I'll point out here, there's recent literature that may be kind of questioning this theory. So there's a lot of recent literature that's suggesting that females actually have precursor cells or stem cells that are kind of laying dormant in the ovaries, and they need to be exposed to certain hormonal influences. So as you guys get older, you guys may be exposed to more developing literature where this initial theory gets debunked, and we prove that menopause is not a default, but is actually an option, right? So there may be some literature that's emerging that's kind of disproving this initial theory that menopause has to happen and not be an option. Okay, so kind of bear that in mind